As you can see, I'm not in my home anymore. I'm in my office at the university. It's vacation time now, but I'm meeting a student later today, so I am setting up shop here, at least for now. And while I'm waiting, I will take care of one or two videos. One video is this one, of course. We're beginning with justice. What is justice? We use the term a lot, constantly, in fact. We use the term whenever we're talking about someone who has been victimized by a crime, and the criminal is brought before the court system so that they can face justice. And if they're not convicted and sentenced to death or whatever horrible penalty we want them to get, then we talk about the victim not getting justice. What does justice mean? Justice has many different definitions. And the difference in definitions has to do with the context, whether it's political, whether it's in the courts, right? Whether it's in social relations. All of these things have different implications for justice. And the idea of justice is associated also with our ethical systems and philosophies that we might have, whether that's ethical formalism or consequentialism, or even virtue ethics. Justice has different meanings according to, well, different contexts and mindsets that we have in using that term. What are we trying to get across? What is the point? At heart, in all of these situations, justice has the idea of fairness and equality, or as some of the woke would say, equity. Actually, I'm not against equity entirely in court systems, for instance, in our justice system, not the criminal justice, but domestic in particular. There are courts of equity. And the court of equity is the court of justice, but when it takes care of the justice issues, it will get into equitable matters. For instance, what is the fair thing to do when a woman or a man has been the house spouse for a period of time? Then upon dissolution of marriage, what is the fair thing? Do we take into consideration only the amount of income that person brought into the house? Well, obviously not, because they brought in nothing as far as income. But their services certainly were worth as much or more than those of the person that did bring in the income into the house. What do we deal with there? We deal with equity, considerations of other things that have value that should be considered by the courts in coming up with a proper disposition of that case, particularly when we talk about property distribution. So equity, it is a valid consideration. It's just that equity has been redefined and bastardized and misused and misapplied in recent times to basically exalt a socialist type thinking in the population of the United States, as opposed to the capitalist or the Republican, the Republic, and the Republic thinking that dominates American society. Rights. Justice has to do with rights. What are those rights? Remember, there's different types of rights. We talked about first-tier rights, second-tier rights, and third-tier rights, the third being identity group rights. So what rights are we considering? Well, justice has a different meaning according to advocates for each one of those types of rights. Some of those types of rights, the advocates would suggest that the other types of rights need to simply go away. They're no longer important, or certainly they're lower priority than the second tier or third tier rights, when in fact, in reality, if we look at it, second and third tier rights tend to be more of the nature of licensure, right? Or propping up or creating entitlements, and not so much rights at all. So for a natural rights advocate like me, the first tier rights, there are no other rights. Everything else is good for society, but it's not necessarily something we should exalt as rights. And we'll talk about immutable characteristics. It has something to do with the rights idea, but that'll be in our next video or the one following that. This might be a series of 3 videos to talk about justice and then finally getting to immutability. Redistribution, where that's appropriate, taking money from some people or assets from some people and giving those assets to other people. That's redistribution. Distribution is when you have many things and then you mete them out to people. Redistribution is when those assets have been meted out to people sometime prior to the present date or time. And now you're taking from the rich or the people that have too many of those assets and giving them to those that have not enough, or vice versa. It could go the other way. Redistribution is a neutral term, and it doesn't necessarily mean stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. It could be stealing from the poor and giving to the rich, but generally not in the context of our discussion about events in America for the past 5 years, 10 years, 20 years actually, but particularly in the past 5 years or 6 years. Compensation, making people feel better by paying them for their loss or their suffering. Right? We hear people talking about remuneration or paying people back for their ancestors having had to experience terrible things like slavery, other types of oppression or suffering at the hands of our government, that kind of stuff. But it's not just that. Anytime somebody sues somebody else in court, they're looking for compensation. They're saying somebody hit my car. It cost me $1,000 to fix my car, and I was unable to use it, and I had to borrow transportation or use a taxi for a period of time. That cost me another $1,000. I want to get that money back somehow, plus pain and suffering. Maybe they're going to complain about that as well, and so they want to be compensated or paid for that pain and suffering. Compensation has many, many different implications. All of these concepts, however, are something that we can associate with justice. Now, as it applies to philosophies, we've only dealt with 3 basic philosophies: utilitarianism or consequentialism, deontology, or what I have called ethical formalism, right? And then virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is not going to play so much into this discussion of justice, but certainly the other 2 play into it to a great extent. So utilitarianism or consequentialism, we can use those terms interchangeably for our purposes. They have slightly different meanings and different implications for the philosophy, but for the purpose of our discussion, we can use those terms interchangeably. It's the Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill philosophy that was developed, saying that things can be considered to be good or just or bad or unjust according to whether it satisfies the majority of the people that are in the suspect or needed or necessary group, the essential group that we need to satisfy, as opposed to deontology or ethical formalism that says that justice is when we get an appropriate response to something that has been done. Right? It's a matter of fairness, and it takes no regard for the effect upon the alleged victims or the witnesses or society at large. It's simply looking to make the penalty fit the crime, or if the crime cannot be proven beyond reasonable doubt, that there be no penalty at all. There be exoneration, a finding of not guilty, not a finding of innocence, but a finding of not guilty. There's a difference. But we won't get into that too much in more detail. Some political philosophers have taken this notion of justice and built an entire philosophy around it. One of the most notable is a guy out of Harvard University named John Rawls, who was quite insightful. He's pretty genius, actually. And he built an entire philosophy around the idea of justice and fairness. All right, so for him, justice was finding or building a society that would satisfy the needs of all the significant groups in society. How would he get to the point of understanding what was significant to one group or another? He would put on a veil, a covering his face, not really, but metaphorically, a veil of ignorance. In other words, he didn't know whether he was a leader in society or someone at the very bottom of society on the social standing ladders. And then he would develop an idea of what is good, what is appropriate, what is bad and inappropriate, based upon that unknowing whether it affects him one way or another. And so theoretically, he would be able to come up with a first position that would be ultimately just to everybody considered. He talked about equal basic liberties, basically protecting the rights of all the people, the members of that particular society, but particularly those people that were the weakest. If we made any policy changes or changes in society, those changes should at least benefit the weak and the poor and the oppressed first. If it benefited everybody else too, that's good, but should always take care of them first. That's enough about John Rawls, although John Rawls is quite insightful, and so it's probably worth taking a look at him. Question is, where does that leave us now? What is justice? Well, justice is finding an appropriate response to a given situation. I come from the criminal justice world, being former criminal attorney and criminal defense attorney, probably criminal attorney too. Well, yeah, but a prosecutor for a couple of years, although I really hated that. I think I let you know that already. A prosecution sucks because you view the rest of the world as guilty of something. It's just a matter of time before we figure it out and nail them for it, right? That's a horrible attitude to have towards other people. But in essence, justice is a starting point. The idea of justice is that there is a set of rules or laws that all of society must live by. If they fail to live by those rules or those laws, then there are certain implications, penalties, or other implications that apply to those people that break those rules and those laws. That's justice. It's a starting point. So it doesn't necessarily have to be resolved whether justice is finding the same punishment for the rich person that violates the law and the poor person that violates the same law, making sure that they get the same penalty, or adjusting the penalty so that the rich person feels the pain as much as the poor person. A $5 fine for a poor person is huge. You might have to have a $5,000 fine for the rich person to have the same effect. Right? That might be some people's notion of justice. But we'll use this idea of justice and explore it a little bit further by dealing with the concepts of grace and mercy. How do those affect justice? Are they the opposite of justice? Do they qualify justice in any kind of way? What are the effects of those basic concepts? And we'll deal with those in the next video. Grace and mercy coming up. Talk to you later.